MSNBC.
In the debt ceiling debate, how are Senate Republicans dealing with their brothers and sisters in the House caucus? That could be an interesting issue for Senator Rob Portman, who serves on the Senate Budget Committee and was the budget director in the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush. Senator, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. The debt ceiling was raised when you were budget director, presumably, because it's been raised so many times over the past couple of years. It was never done with all of this fuss. Why now? Why has this become such a big deal?
Well, I think it's for the same reason you see in the credit agency comments from Standard & Poor's and Fitch and Moody's, which is that the underlying problem, the high levels of debt, record deficits, must be addressed. And so even if we weren't having this discussion about whether to raise the debt ceiling or not, we would have to address this underlying problem. They have sort of coincided. By the way, this will happen again at the end of September if it's not resolved here, because that's when the continuing resolution ends for this year's funding. But this is the underlying issue that has to be addressed.
Senator, I wanted to play a little bit of the president's comments at La Raza. We think maybe even the thunderstorms interrupted our coverage of that, but this is what he had to say. He was very combative, and he also said that we had to deal with taxes in some fashion, that you can't deal with spending cuts alone. Let me play a little bit about it for you.
Neither party is blameless for the decisions that led to our debt. But both parties have a responsibility to come together and solve the problem and make sure that the American people aren't hurt. If we don't address the debt that's already on our national credit card, it will leave us unable to invest in things like education, to protect vital programs.
Now, to your point of a short-term deal and the fact that the continuing resolution is going to expire in September, only a week or so ago, Eric Cantor was against a short-term deal. Now the sticking point seems to be that the Republicans want to do a short-term deal and revisit this at the beginning of the year, whereas the White House says they want it to carry through 2012. Isn't there some way to resolve this disagreement?
Well, there is, Andrea, and I don't think it's so much a matter of short-term versus long-term. It really gets down to the tax issue that you raised. In other words, I'm sure Republicans in the House, I know Republicans in the Senate would be happy to have a longer-term decision here, because that would mean more spending reductions. But in order to do that, the president has insisted that there be tax increases now committed to. And many of us believe that with this weak economy, that's not smart. Rather, we should be reforming the tax code. The way in which we collect our taxes is the issue, and economists across the board tend to agree with that. In other words, they think that by changing the code and making it more efficient and focusing more on growth and investment, you're going to increase economic activity and therefore increase revenue. So that's the difference of opinion. It's not long or short term.
The deal that was on the table, excuse me, from the White House perspective, the deal that John Boehner walked away from, did have an extension through 2013, and the details of the revenue side, were supposed to be dealt with down the road. There was disagreement over the trigger, the enforcement mechanism, how to guarantee that that would actually take place. But that would get to the issue. Why can't Republicans and Democrats sit down and agree on tax reform? And it obviously takes weeks, months, perhaps as long as a year to get to that. You know that better than I. Why not deal with that down the road? But what's wrong with extending the debt ceiling through 2013?
Well, I think if you're going to stick with the formula that seems to be accepted now by all parties, which you only increase the debt limit to the extent of which you reduce spending, that's the, $1 trillion is about 6 months, 2.5 is until the end of the election cycle. Then the question is, can you do this, without raising taxes or not? So I think what you're suggesting is that there could be a compromise where there could be a commitment to tax reform in the short term. And I think that's essentially what this two-stage process is. It says, let's go ahead and agree to the $1 trillion, which all of us can find, because the Biden group, the Gang of Six, the President's Fiscal Commission have come up with actually about $2.8 trillion worth of spending reductions. Let's agree to about $1 trillion. And in that time period, and it will take that much time, let's actually go through the process of real tax reform and looking at the longer-term spending problems, report back. And I guess the compromise may be, what kind of mechanism will there be at that point to raise the debt limit? But I think the two-stage process is where we're going to end up, because we simply don't have time to deal with these bigger issues like tax reform. And by the way, if you look back historically, as I think usually the debt limit is for less than a year. 34 of the last 44 have been for less than a year. So this notion that short term is somehow the exception, it's actually the rule.
But you know this world better than I do. Would you want to be going through this again in the spring in terms of the instability, the markets, the slowness of the economy, and how stalled this recovery has been? Why go through this agony again?
Yeah, it is kind of agonizing, isn't it? But I think what the markets are looking for, again, is dealing with the underlying problem. So if there's a commitment made now to meaningful and credible reductions, and then a process to come up with even further reductions and some structural changes in our spending, I think the markets would respond better than if we simply extended the debt limit or used some budget gimmicks to try to make it look good. So it's going to depend on the substance of the agreement, and if during that 6-month period there's a serious effort through this select committee they're talking about or some other process to get there, I think markets would react more favorably to that than simply extending the debt limit. Extending it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You've got to deal with the underlying problem.
And is Senator McConnell's proposal still on the table, and is that a fallback position for you?
Well, I think what Senator McConnell did with that proposal was two things. One, he reassured the markets, and I think you've seen the positive effect that's had. Second, I think it got everybody focused on the fact that we do need to reduce spending. And so I think it's had a salutary effect. I think it's had the effect that he intended. And I think what you're going to see come out of this process over what is, sometimes difficult to watch, but the political process over the next 24 hours is a serious proposal that actually reduces spending short term, and then perhaps has a second stage where there is tax reform and a look at the more structural changes that are needed on our debt and deficit to deal with it. So I think that's
Senator,
where we're going to end up, Andrea.
What would you say to some of the House Republicans? You served in the House. What would you say to some of the House Republicans, some of those freshmen who say this is not such a big deal? Oh, let's go past the deadline. Default isn't an issue.
Well, I think it's a risk we should not take. I think it has economic risks because I do think that the rating agencies would then downgrade our debt, and I do think that there would be the possibility of default, not so much on interest on the bondholders, which can be paid, but more when you roll over our debt. There might be some issues as interest rates go up. And we just can't afford that right now. We have a weak economy already. The growth numbers are disappointing. The increase in the jobless rate is very discouraging. So it's time for all of us to come together and figure out not how do we make it more risky, but how do we create more certainty in the economy. And there are a number of things we need to do in addition to tax reform, regulatory relief, and expanding exports and getting energy costs down. But let's not go into this post-debt limit period. Let's instead figure out the spending cuts between us. I think we can get there. Again, there seems to be an agreement forming between the House Republicans and the Senate Democrats that we do need to cut spending. Let's do that and move forward and avoid that risk.
Former Budget Director, Senator Rob